There are two major concerns that we have related to pan flu that I'll share with you, and I think probably all of you have come across questions related to these two issues. From my perspective, the most difficult thing that we're dealing with is the fact that we do not know when the flu is going to hit, pandemic flu. And we do not know for sure how severe this particular pandemic is going to be. And when you don't know the answer to those two questions, it's very, very difficult to get the public engaged in the planning efforts that are essential to be able to respond appropriately to pandemic. There are some things, though, that are happening that are making us, I think, progressively become a bit more concerned and nervous about the fact that the pandemic may be sooner rather than later. Frankly, when we first started this pandemic planning in earnest, which was basically December of 2005, right after the National Summit, we'd been planning not so much in earnest since at least 1999 from the epi perspective only. But in 2005, we started looking at all sector planning. And basically, as we really began to get into it, I was thinking, you know, based on what I remember from med school, pandemics were something that were just historically interesting, but in this day and age, we've had so many technological advances, I really didn't think that this was something that we would have to contend with. I thought it was history only. But as I started looking at the situation, I became much more aware that I had been totally wrong, that pandemics have been with us throughout the centuries, and that there's nothing in our technology now that's going to keep us from having another pandemic. There are things that may moderate that pandemic that are technologically valuable for us, but there's nothing out there that's going to prevent it. And that's, for me, a kind of frightening situation when you stop and think about the impact of pandemics, the fact that we're talking about something that's not just here in Georgia, it's not just here in Augusta, it's not just in the United States, it's worldwide. And it's a health emergency without any doubt, but it's far more than that. It's a true societal emergency. It impacts every single sector of society. There's very little else that really is that comprehensive if you stop and think about it. A lot of horrible things can happen that we're trying to be prepared for, but there are very few things that are as comprehensive as pandemic. So I think there's good reason to prepare as best we can. There's good reason to be concerned about it, not to the point of being frightened and unable to function, but I think we need a healthy degree of anxiety about this in order to really proceed. And that's why I'm not really trying to get away from the Dr. Doom modality. I think that that really helps us to have that certain degree of concern and anxiety. It stimulates us maybe to be a bit more productive in our planning, I hope. Well, as I said, my first revelation was that we were still going to be dealing with pandemics. Historically, we know we had 3 in the last century. There's no real timing to this, so you can't predict exactly when it's going to happen, but you know that it's coming. We've got this H5N1 that's been out there for over 10 years, the really bad one in Southeast Asia. And that's a great concern because, as Dr. Julie Gerberding has said, if you're a bird, it's already a pandemic. Not for humans, but for birds it truly is. When this particular virus crosses over into humans, it's extremely lethal. Now, those of you who have looked at the 1918 pandemic will probably recall that the death rate back in 1918 was what? Anyone? Roughly 2%. How about the death rate of this H5N1 as it's affected people across the world now? 60%. So 20 to 30 times more lethal than the 1918, which is, as far as we can remember, one of the worst that's ever impacted the world. And yet, the potential, if this H5N1 becomes readily transmissible person to person and maintains this type of lethality, the potential for the amount of death is absolutely overwhelming. And I think we have to stop and look at some modeling and bring it down to Georgia to get a real picture of what we may be dealing with here. We anticipate that when the pandemic strikes in Georgia, there will be roughly 3 million people who will be ill with pandemic influenza. That's based on current population. Obviously, if the pandemic is several years away, population will probably be much greater and the numbers will be greater. But right now it looks like 3 million people will be ill. We anticipate that of those 3 million, about 300,000 will require hospitalization. Now, how many licensed, staffed hospital beds do we have in Georgia today? Anybody from the hospital community? We have 16,000 staffed, licensed beds. We have 23,000 licensed beds, but quite a few of them are not staffed. So 16,000 beds, but we're anticipating 300,000 people needing hospitalization during the pandemic. We're anticipating 6,000 admissions per week during the height of the pandemic, just with pandemic influenza, and everything else, the heart attacks, the strokes, and diabetic problems, all that's still going to be here too. It isn't going to go away. So the surge situation gets to be rather ominous.